Hi, so thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Erica. We're talking about compliant by design, privacy versus KYC. So I thought I'd start with some nice stats and facts about the traditional KYC model as it is now. So KYC now, the market costs about $200 billion a year. According to the UN, the Department of Drugs and Crime, it stops under 1% of global financial crime. And of that, the UN estimates it actually freezes and manages to sort of stop being in the markets, less than 0.2% of total financial crime. But the UN is optimistic. Academic research calculates that the KYC and compliance market, as it is now, stops under 0.2% of global financial crime. And this is for TradFi as well, where about 2 to 5% of all global money is laundered. There's other problems with the traditional KYC compliance model as it is now. North Koreans are able to fly around the world on fake passports and get jobs and be onboarded at financial institutions. That happens quite readily, not just North Koreans. There's a lot of problems with the data that KYC collects. There's been some conversation about that today. The data from the traditional model goes into big honeypots, and 46% of global data breaches are for the data that is collected for KYC and compliance. So some sort of pretty sobering stats there around sort of the traditional model. So looking forward, I wanted to start with Saj and go into, is there anything, Saj, that you think that KYC and the traditional sort of compliance model does now and achieves now that cannot be done by some of the means that have already been discussed here in the last 2 days, such as by zero knowledge?
Thank you, Erica. I find those statistics very interesting because, again, it shows that our current sort of model that is being used by TradFi is sort of the dominant position that crypto is trying to also be part of, is in many ways broken, in that the people who do have a KYC issue know that, and they will navigate that quite successfully, either with fake passports or a topic that we'll touch upon, I think, sort of KYC mules, so getting someone else's KYC and getting through. And that's at the individual level. At the sort of institutional level, and in my law firm days, and I'm sure you experience this as well, when you're trying to KYC and onboard a new client, many companies can have opaque shareholding structures by design. So effectively, anyone who thinks they have a KYC problem already structures around that so that they can quite successfully pass through the filters that the current system creates. I think in crypto, we are trying to build products that address the current system and create products that will at least alleviate some of the frictions of this system where, as we heard in some of the talks yesterday, multiple times a year, we will have to hand over all of our personal information and documents, highly sensitive documents, to institutions that we have no oversight to how they use it, what their data protection policies are, what other activities they may be able to do with our documents. At least in crypto, with zero knowledge, we can get a token or otherwise to show that, yes, we have passed KYC, and this is the proof that we have, without actually giving them the data to then expose ourselves to the threat of data leakage and violation of our privacy.
Thank you. Charlie, you spend a lot of time, I know because I work with Charlie, talking to regulators and TradFi as well as the crypto world. What are the main barriers and blockers that you see for adoption of something like zero knowledge? And what are the main fears of the TradFi and of regulators to get fully on board with accepting a newer version of compliance checks?
Yeah, and I spend time being a regulator, so I'm just finishing my term on the board of a Middle Eastern Web3 focused regulator. And what was interesting to me about that role was that different regulators come at the similar questions from different perspectives. And I think in crypto we spend time facing the financial regulators who have an interest in information being collected and maintained. So you reference financial crime. The financial regulators care about protocols and projects not facilitating financial crime, not screwing the customer, and not creating systemic risk in a financial system. So that requires information to be collected and retained. There are other regulators, the data regulators, and Europe is a standout for this, have the opposite approach. The GDPR regulation is designed to prevent commercial entities storing and collecting information that is greater than is necessary. To summarize what that regulation is trying to do, is trying to say to commercial parties, you can only keep information about your customers if you've got the minimum amount, if you're keeping the minimum amount of information that you need to provide the service to the customers. If you don't need it anymore, you should delete it. So there are competing priorities at different regulators. I think the short answer to your question about how do you get regulators to understand is you've got to tell them. Most regulation is principles-based. If we in this room have a better solution for addressing the concerns that regulators have about storing information but minimizing the amount of information that's available and can therefore be hacked, and similar, that the regulators and all policymakers are well aware that we have a gigantic hacking issue that is only just starting to leak into people's everyday experience. So if you've got a solution that's a technical solution, explain it to the regulators. They're open-minded. We had years where financial regulators particularly were not open to decentralized projects and protocols. They assumed that it was people who were trying to hide something from them so they could live outside regulation. We're through that. Most regulators, including the UK financial regulator, now accept that decentralization is a thing. They should engage with it. They should deal with it on its own terms, not try and pretend that it's something which is analogous to TradFi. It can do similar things in a different way. And so telling them, ensuring there's not a communication gap, I think is the best answer.
Thank you. There's, as Charlie mentioned, there's huge differences around the world, and also crime is by nature international, and it might be that perpetrator is in one country and computer used and servers used, and everything is all in different countries. It's a cross-border issue. Saj, practically speaking, how might you get sort of compliance by design built in so that it works on a cross-border and satisfies or regulators and works with the reality that crime is a very international problem?
Yes, I think the way that through practical reasons this is measured, you often look at the regulator with the biggest stick to cater to. So if you're worried about enforcement action by the US or a multi-million-dollar fine by the SEC or OFAC sanctions, that is the compliance regime that you will look to primarily. And then you will, for example, look at others that have a significant overlap with that, whether it's the UK or the EU. Oftentimes you see the enforcement sort of actions coming out of the EU are fewer, so then you use the US one as your primary one. If there's any sort of anomalies for that in the UK or in the EU, you either ignore or you try to address if you have enough resources. So there's also that sort of element of how all of this gets addressed. But it also creates some really odd outcomes. So, for example, there are 3 regions in Ukraine that are part of territorial sanctions because they're controlled by Russia. But because you can't sort of divide the IP address of Ukraine, you effectively then impose territorial sanctions on Ukraine as a whole. So a policy that, at least in theory, should be sort of supporting Ukraine by sanctioning those regions, it adds to another layer of collective punishment. Another way that comes up is that if you are, for example, born in Russia, and you may be living in London or also a UK citizen, but because your place of birth is Russia or Iran or other countries that are on the wrong side of sanction regimes, again, there's another sort of layer of collective punishment there where these things come up in your banking transactions and other transactions. And ironically, you may be fleeing those very countries for political reason or otherwise, but once you are sort of out, you still are the subject of the same sort of compliance regimes that are effectively not adequately designed, and you also get a lot of what I call lazy compliance, whereas a bank may just say, you know what, like, for example, if you're born in Russia, I don't want to do business with you. And the complication is sometimes you see those very same banks are banking, for example, oligarchs or others. So it's like if you have again, back to my first point, if you have enough means, you can quite easily circumvent a lot of the compliance protections that a lot of TradFi institutions have. And it actually then catches in its net a lot of people that are probably not the intended targets for these regimes. So this trying to follow the mosaic of compliance regimes is quite difficult, but I think with the advancements of technology, we will be able to have a more granular approach that is probably better fit for purpose.
Thank you. And a big part of the traditional system now is regulators want a neck to wring. They want to know who's accountable and who they can blame for something going wrong, and sort of the system works because with the sort of traditional KYC and compliance setup, you have clear responsibility path, which is arguably less overtly clear when you get on to centralized technology and zero-knowledge proofs. How do you get around that, Charlie, from a sort of a legal perspective with implementing sort of compliance by design using zero-knowledge proofs? Who's responsible, and how do you make that very, very clear to regulators?
Yeah, so you're right that their starting assumption is that there's going to be a person or an organization that needs to be responsible. But what's sitting behind compliance by design or privacy by design is that there can be engineering solutions to this, and you can present those to the regulator, they can be satisfied. As you know, in the team, we're often asked to help projects judge, are we compliant by design? Are we private by design? We can give people a short answer before we start, which is, if it is hard or uneconomic for someone in a team to breach the compliance or privacy rules, then you're compliant by design. It's going to be more trouble than it's worth for people inside the organization not to comply. If you can demonstrate that to regulators, you won half the battle. So there is no incentive on a human being inside an organization to build or work outside the rules that have been set from an engineering perspective. Then you've achieved it. So it starts with a kind of legal regulatory review. This is what the rules are wanting you to do. But it's mainly an engineering problem, that once you've got that engineering and being able to demonstrate to the regulators that, as Saj says, whenever there's a system, people set about gaming it. So can the system be gamed, or is it more trouble than it's worth? That's generally what we're looking at when we're asked that question.
Going back to the wider problem of KYC and compliance, I note that my colleague Charlie travelled here on the tube today with his name badge saying his name on the tube in full display, I'm guessing. There's a bigger problem about KYC, and one that I'd ask you, Saj, can this be fixed? You touched on the idea of your marketplaces. That's a massive issue. There's entire marketplaces of people who are no fault of their own, people who've lost incomes, and largely due to the pandemic and the economic situation, who need money. They need an income. They need to feed their families. And there's also industry offering the money for them to be used. And these are, until now, sort of totally legitimate unknown citizens to bypass KYC. And there's, whole price packages for bypass KYC once or bypass KYC on an ongoing annualized basis. And that's a real world problem. You've also got AI tools that can just bypass KYC. We've all seen the demos where AI can be used to bypass onboarding for the big TradFi companies, the big crypto companies, for fake passports. It's a wider problem. Can that problem be solved, Serge, using these technologies?
Yeah, I tend to think, there's no tech problem that arise that tech can't solve. Same with legal problems. It's like no problems are arisen by lawyers that lawyers can't solve. So it's almost like I think with the advancement of technology and then the use cases that we see, we come to understand that the current system is not without its faults. There are many ways that it can be gamed. It effectively catches a lot of people that it shouldn't, and it doesn't catch a lot of people that it should. I think that things like blockchain technology, where you can have sort of trust in a trustless environment, does help us start to address some of these issues. And I think we're still early in this, in that as the capability increases, the ways that these issues can be addressed, both technologically and legally, there will be more options at our disposal.
I like that point. It's a cultural issue, and I think we talk about this a lot in the team where Erica and I work. We have a little team. We hired all our lawyers out of the crypto firms because they just get it. And trying to explain to people who've got a mental model that doesn't come from crypto or decentralization or open source is difficult. This is, for most people in the room, I think you're too young for this, but in the early days of the internet, something like 1992, there's a very famous cartoon in The New Yorker. There's a dog sitting on a chair in front of a computer, and there's a dog sitting on the floor talking to the other dog. And the dog in front of the computer says, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." Now, that's what we're trying to get back to, because these days, on the internet, everyone would know you're a dog. You're going to get adverts for dog food all day long. So when we're showing to regulators what we're trying to get back to, The New Yorker in 1992 is setting as the target.
We've gone on to dogs. Good. Sash, I mean, touching on the dogs and the people, and you've touched on it, there's about 1 billion people in the world who can't be compliant today because they don't have the documents to pass KYC around the world. So it's a lot of people. Can technology solutions like Midnight solve that problem? If so, how, or how do you envisage that working so that everybody can be onboarded when they want to be?
This is a very interesting topic, and I see it come up when, again, as Charlie was mentioning, when we sort of step out of the dominant paradigm that we are exposed to in places like London and other financial centers, and then are reminded that, oh, the world is a very big place. There is, 1 billion people who are unbanked or unbankable, and that have gravitated towards crypto. I was working with a exchange that was trying to onboard the next billion into crypto. That was their slogan, and they were targeting countries like Indonesia, where some mind-blowing statistic, young population, only 9% own stocks and shares, or part of the formal economy, whereas 23% own crypto. So it's like they've almost leapfrogged that sort of indicator of sort of financial assets into the next rung up because crypto was more easily accessible. And that's even in more sort of established crypto platforms. We haven't even touched upon DeFi and DEXs where you're effectively not KYC'd. And that poses a problem because obviously if you are providing liquidity to a pool, you want to be sure you're not market making opposite a North Korean actor. So there are real considerations there. But I was speaking to people actually at this conference and talking about, well, how do you, they were running a DEX, and it's like, how do you try to address that? And there were very interesting ways that are emerging as the industry matures. So, for example, they were providing their DEX was providing a liquidity pool for RWAs. And some of those RWAs are effectively KYC'd because they're property. Or, you know, they are property owned by a company who has shareholders. And then there's sort of a link that you can see, okay, well, this is all, it has been KYC'd in some part of the journey, if not necessarily when put on the DEX or taken off the DEX. So I think there are, again, technological solutions emerging where, for example, if this asset is KYC'd, a token may be attached to that product to know, okay, well, this effectively ticks the box and you're not sort of operating opposite a nefarious actor.
Cool, thank you. We've got 2.5 minutes left, so in about 80 seconds each. What are your thoughts on what is needed? What can we do to get regulators, the traditional world, and even, being honest, the centralized parts of crypto, which are very centralized and very data heavy in some cases, to see that putting privacy first is 100% the best solution?
Yeah, people are building for this. I was reading about Zama when I got home last night, catching up on my newsletters. There's only going to be more automation, not less, as we go through the next few years. And the markets understand that, the regulators understand that. So it's for you guys to solve these problems. They can be addressed by engineering, and I think our role is to help you understand what they are and give you some guidance about what you're doing. But these are things that can be addressed. So having open conversations, don't ignore it. If you're accidentally laundering money, it's not going to do anything for your token price.
Brilliant. And Serge?
I think, I look forward to a world where sort of the crypto industry itself has a seat at the table and a voice with the regulator rather than recycling old systems and trying to cater solutions for those systems that we know are oftentimes not fit for purpose. If we can almost come to it afresh and provide solutions that have not been thought of before, with the added impetus of new and more advanced technology, come and address some of the problems that I think we all agree that we don't want to facilitate proceeds of crime being laundered through crypto. It's not good for our industry, and it's not why we are here. To sort of find better ways to ensure that we are an effective barrier against that, but not to other adoption and other people coming into this sector that have been excluded from, for example, the banking sector or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for having us. And please thank Charlie and Serge.